One sec.
Okay, we're live now. Okay, thank you. And for those of you who are just joining us, welcome to the Select Committee on the Future of Public Higher Education in Vermont. It's Monday, January 11th. And we have a pretty full agenda today. I know that the NCHEMS consultants sent to us a copy of their next, a working copy of the next iteration of the draft. And we're going to spend a lot of time looking at that. For members of the public, I know that that has been posted on our website. Just as a reminder, if members of the public have comments or questions, please submit those in writing. It's at the bottom of our agenda, but just as if you don't have the agenda, it's all one word, higher ed committee at ledge.state.vt.us. So again, if you have comments or questions, please submit those to the group. And as I announced at our steering committee meeting, we're going to handle the comments a slightly different. If you have questions that you would like to pose to the steering committee, please submit those. We will leave time at the end for questions. If you have comments, in the past, we've asked Joyce Manchester to summarize the comments, and it's really hard for Joyce because she gets a lot of them and then we ask her to summarize them. So rather than that, what we're going to do is just simply post them. And I would ask all committee members to make a commitment to go on and read all of the comments that public members have submitted, because it's very important that we hear from the public and also take into consideration their concerns. So again, committee members, I'm going to ask you to make that a priority after a meeting to go in and review the comments. So today, really what we want to do is Brian is going to walk us through, Brian, Dennis, Sally, whoever, are going to walk us through the red line changes from the 12-4 report. And so I hope you've all had a chance to look at those, particularly where we've made changes. And then Candace and Brian will give us an update on where we are with some of the stakeholder focus groups that we have been wanting to make sure that we this is another way for us to get public comment. And then we'll talk about some of the next steps in terms of our work. Just as a reminder, the next select committee meeting will be on February 8th. And the next report is due to the legislative committee, legislative leadership, and to the governor's office on February 12th. So just put those two dates in your mind. February 8th, we will be reviewing the final draft, but have time to provide additional comments. But the next report will be due on February 12th. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Brian, who is going to take us through the red line, the changes that they've made from the December 4th report to now. So Brian, take it away.
Hey, thank you, Joyce. And Happy New Year to those of you I haven't seen in two dimensions yet. Before I get carried away, can you all hear me? I've had such continual problems with my microphone. I want to make sure I don't need to put my headphones on. So is everyone hearing me? I'm getting a thumbs down.
We can hear you fine. Yep.
I got a thumbs down from one person.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you, but it's very fuzzy.
Well, I hope that's just an audio thing. Hold on a second. I should have assumed it wasn't going to work. All right, is that any better? That's better?
Fine on my end. Senator
Okay.
Baruth, is that better? You're on mute, Senator.
It's better, but I think there's still some fuzziness there.
Well, it's also, I don't look as good with these giant cans on my ears either. So, but we'll do the best we can. I'll speak up. Is that? I'll do. That's the best I can do. We've been trying to get this resolved now for a little while. I apologize for it. I wanted to quickly run through at a high level what the changes were. I know you all read this, but from our perspective, and then we can dive into the specifics of these things as we go. But probably, at least in terms of the volume of content, the biggest change was the addition of the affordability section. That was a section that appeared in, portions of that section appeared in an earlier draft, which ultimately we pulled for the December 4th meeting in response to questions about why we were making that recommendation and what was in it, and what justified the need to talk about an affordability standard in the state. We expanded that discussion and included it in this report, and we're happy to talk about what's in it in just a moment. That was the biggest section. Other really critical ones that we heard from you required additional work included estimates of the cost of inaction in order to sort of build the case for some of these investments we're talking about in this report. And so we added, I think, substantially to that sections that appear in the case for urgency, as well as in the resource allocation sections of this document. And then we added, at your request, a bunch of additional content related to the nature of the unification that has been recommended. These include increases in efficiencies through disaggregations of expenditure categories. Also some estimates to try to get at what kind of, what's realistic for finding additional revenue that comes from enrollment through tuition. And that we broke that down into revenue that comes from students returning after having taken time off due to COVID, as well as better outreach to students from high school as well as adults. And then in addition to that, we had some requests for additional feedback or additional content around the integration of VTC in particular, its culture and programs into the unified institution. And so we provided some information about that as well, both in terms of the benefits, the challenges of addressing VTC, case studies of relevant institutional consolidations. And we're also trying to be mindful of the role that the select committee will play relative to this as opposed to the BSC board and leadership. A couple of more minor changes that you should see in there is that we gathered from feedback that was reported to us, I can't remember where, one of which was that there's a perception in the report that we submitted on December 4th that we're talking about substantially larger chancellor's office, and that was not what we have in mind. So we tried to be a little clearer in articulating what that means. And then secondly, in the first draft, we did not give much attention, maybe no attention to the fact that there are graduate programs in the BSc institutions. And so we've tried to address what we mean by graduate programs. So those are sort of the big buckets of changes that we made. But I'm still telling you stuff you already know from having read it. And I think at this point, I'd like to open it up for a conversation around each of these. I think it might make sense for us to start with the affordability section, in part because it was the largest piece, but also because Breyer is not able to join us and President Garamella has to leave a little bit early. So we've gotten some feedback about the reappearance of UVM related to that section, and I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to have that conversation addressed. So I don't know, Suresh, if you're prepared to talk a little bit about that, but I know that that's a subject that we need to work on. So
Sure.
I'll open up the floor.
Yeah, Brian, happy to just make a comment or two, if that's okay with you and Joyce.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So Brian, actually, I read the report and it was very helpful to have the red line version. You've clearly been very busy since our last meeting. And I noticed all the added detail, the cost charts, the examples of experience of others who've gone down this path. I think they're all very helpful additions. So it sounds to me that your group, and I don't know if the steering committee had a lot to do with this too, but has been, I think, very effective and productive. The only real comment I have to share is that I was surprised to see the recommendation to include UVM in the oversight and the reporting requirements around affordability. So just as a reminder, on affordability, as is, I think, widely recognized now, this is a personal priority for me. And we at UVM are going to a third year now with frozen tuition, and we're reducing our fees, making it cheaper to attend next year than it was last year. So, it's clearly big for us. We allocate 75% of our state appropriation to essentially to help this out, in that it goes to financial support for our Vermont students. 75% of our state appropriation. And I think you know this, that nearly half of Vermonters who attend UVM pay zero tuition, zero. And then almost all the others get quite significant discounts. So our goal is to not lose any Vermonter who gets admission to UVM to not attend because of finances. And I think we've actually been successful at that. Our analysis of the applicants and such shows that. So I guess all I would say is that we should probably stay with our past discussion, that we had a fairly robust discussion, as I recall, in the last or second last meeting before the end of the year, that the study should be focused on, and its recommendation should be focused on VSC, and not sort of convolve it or confuse it with talking about higher ed in general across the state. And so I think we should continue to leave UVM out of these kinds of specific bits when the report isn't addressed at that. I think the report would be more valuable if it stays with VSC. So as I said, I did find the additions quite useful, and I'm sure the legislature will appreciate them as well. But there's that small change I would make so that we're not confusing the issue. Thanks for asking for the comment.
Sure, and in response to that, and not necessarily a defensive one, given that we had that discussion previously for the December report about the presence of UVM in the document, I wanted to at least mention that in the work that NCHIMS has done and I've done previously in other states, we've always taken the position that affordability is a student-focused measurement, like the one that we're describing in this report, and that it is applicable. The states have generally wanted to think of it as a broad concern, including for research universities, and in places where the standard is most directly used is in the distribution of state aid to students attending institutions in all sectors in the state, sometimes including private institutions as well. So to the degree that this came as a surprise to those folks from UVM, that it reappeared, we wanted to be sure that you at least understood the background behind the way we work around the affordability standard and so on and so forth. We do think that the growth in the role of institutional aid is a trend that deserves monitoring across the country, really, in all sectors, and including it in some ways in the construction of a metric is useful for state funding decisions generally. But I think that, at least from the perspective of our point of view, we know that what we're doing is proposing language for the state select committee to debate and ultimately decide how this recommendation related to affordability goes forward. And so we're happy to, I just don't want y'all to think that we were trying to spring something on you. This is just really how we think about this stuff.
Yeah.
So,
and Brian, I know others have their hand up, but just because I raised the point, I would also say that, I was honestly, it was an education for me when I came here, how different this state public flagship is compared to almost every other one I know of, in that, basically Vermont doesn't have very many students that go to, higher ed, and therefore, given our reliance on out-of-state students, and primarily that we're funded by out-of-state tuition and such, and the fact, of course, that we get so little from the state, is very different from almost any other public higher ed situation, research or otherwise. And so I think that your general approach to these things in studies in other states probably doesn't apply in Vermont. I would also say that there's a significant additional cost for this kind of regulatory compliance, if you will, and we're all trying to push back on regulatory compliance from federal sources. And so a very lean administration, and it's already very thinly stretched. It just seems to me like, and so that's what drove some of what I said. And also, given the kind of institution we are, the data, some of the data that I think, it's hard to know exactly how it would look, is sort of intellectual property that's resident in a fairly complex system that's used for scholarships and recognizing merit and so on. So I guess I understand where it came from now, but I will stick with my recommendation. Thanks.
So Representative James had her hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm on an iPad, so I'm having a hard time toggling between the meeting and the document. So I'll just briefly say that it's my recollection that that section of the report had to do with how the legislature considers and strategically allocates its state aid for higher ed in general. And so being able to, I guess, compare or have information from the state colleges as well as UVM when we're considering an overall allocation for post-secondary ed would seem to me to be important. And so I'd like to see that remain.
So I think that the issue, the principal issue that that we're discussing isn't necessarily that the affordability standard is poorly conceptualized in this document. I think it has principally to do with the recommendation that we put forward that VSC and UVM be required to provide data for VSC to turn into a report. And I think that it's fair to say that there's ample publicly available and required data to do the basics of an analysis such as what we're talking about that would be a couple of years in arrears from IPEDS. And I think that data may be somewhere in the appendix of this report already. But what that means is that there's a lag in having the data, and it only applies to certain students. So the degree to which we are making this recommendation that I think is troublesome from the perspective of at least President Garamella, if not others, is the requirement that there be data submitted for further analysis by VSAC. We had hoped that by doing that, we could keep some of that issue regarding the intellectual property nature you were discussing shielded behind a state agency in the sense that was a neutral third party. But at the end of the day, I think there's two questions. One is whether or not this affordability standard is constructed in a way that makes sense. And then the specific recommendation around the requirement that UVM supply that data to VSAC for preparations of reports. And if that's not a fair characterization of the issue, then somebody please straighten me out. Okay, I'm not hearing any more commentary or concerns, recommendations on the affordability section. So we will make an up.
Whoops.
Never mind.
Steve Gordon
raised
has,
his hand.
Yeah, so just an editorial, can you guys hear me?
yes.
Yes.
Just an editorial comment. I had to drive down to Hartford, Connecticut. And as I got right towards Hartford, there's a big lit up billboard that says University of Maine system will match in-state tuition for UConn. So I think you're going to see a lot more competition along these lines, going back towards that, the issue of affordability, matching in-state tuition.
Sarah?
On the issue of affordability, this may be bleeding into the conversation around the work study program. So I'm happy to have you cut me off and reserve that for a further point in time. But I'm trying to find a page here. Around page 61, and now I'm scrolling back and forth. Part of the justification we have for requiring a variety of entities, including Department of Labor and the colleges, in exploring the feasibility of a state work study program. It seems the way we characterize it seems to say that by giving students the opportunity to work and earn, that we're contributing to making college more affordable for students. And while that may be true in some cases, I think the stronger argument for creating, and I would say not work study, but an internship program of some kind of larger scale, I think the more important public policy reason to have that in place is not necessarily for the extra $1,000 it puts into any student's pocket over the course of the year, but because it helps to connect them with jobs with a local employer and strengthens that pipeline development between the state college system and meeting our employment demands in the state. So I just wanted to provide that feedback in terms of, first, I'm still not sold on the fact that we need a state work study program. I do think we could make a more robust a paid work experience system. But if we were to continue to push that forward as one of our recommendations, I might say that it's for the purpose of strengthening those talent pipelines and is helping especially the out-of-state students or out-of-town students find employment opportunities right here in Vermont and meeting those needs of the employers. So I just wanted to provide that feedback.
And I would just, by way of response, say yes to all of that. And I think, have some conversations to have and work to do around how that actually gets structured. This, I think, was a little bit of a legacy of the original draft of this section that we didn't alter, but we know we've got some clarifications to make on that topic.
Brian, I have a question, and I was wondering if you could talk this through with the group. And this is about, and just actually, I want to go back to Suresh's comment. The steering committee and the select committee received this report at the same time. So the steering committee has not had a chance to talk about this beforehand. So we're doing this all together. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the shared responsibility model. And I would this is all new to me in terms of how you come up with this. And I would love for this group to provide feedback. Does it make sense to you? Is this something that, it's an interesting way to come up with an affordability standard. And Brian, I'm wondering if you could share, are other states using this? It's just a new concept, and I want to make sure that the select committee understands this concept and take out the UVM, whether we include UVM or not. I think the whole idea of a shared responsibility model around getting to affordability is an interesting concept and something that would be very new and very different, even if it was just for the Vermont State Colleges. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about how other states have used it, and then I would love to hear from this committee in terms of, does this make sense? So I guess I would just ask that.
Yeah, great. So the model that we use is a lot like what a financial aid officer in an institution would do to package a student. One of the key differences is between what we're talking about here and where a lot of the free tuition scholarship type programs or free college programs start with is we're beginning with a cost of attendance because quite often, given the way that the Pell Grant works in a lot of states, free tuition is a cheap and affordable way to get a big public policy win because the Pell Grant covers the cost of full cost of attendance at community colleges. And so it actually, free college as implemented in a lot of states, as a contrast to this, doesn't actually deliver any additional dollars to a lot of the full-time lowest income students that are enrolled in the community college sector at least. And so we begin with the fact that in order to attend college, you have tuition, fees, books and supplies, and a whole bunch of living expenses. And we're defining the affordability standard on the basis of how much a person should be expected to work at minimum wage, so as that level of work is not distracting to the students' academic pursuits. And research suggests that somewhere between 15 and 18 hours a week, students who have up to that much amount of work are still able to stay on track and focus sufficiently on their academic goals to achieve them if they're enrolled full time. So the expectation begins with that level of work as a student contribution that's consistent across all income categories. And then the next step is how much can a family contribute beyond that? So for dependent students, it's just the portion of income that their parents can contribute. And for independent students, it's generally either nothing or a reasonable share of what the spouse might be able to contribute. And that inclusion of the family contribution is what makes the way you think about this shared responsibility framework sensitive to income. And beyond that, then we start to include Pell Grants primarily, possibly tax credits and other federal grants like Social Security, then the state grant component, then institutional grants and waivers. And it's generally structured to be disaggregated this way so that the state policymakers who are choosing between making investments in direct appropriations and state financial aid programs really have a clear picture of how it's impacting students at different income levels on the ground in reality and in relatively current dollars. So that's the way that the model works. The states that have been using something like this for the longest is Minnesota. Oregon also uses it to determine eligibility for their state grant program. And that is how the model often gets implemented, is on the state financial aid side. We aren't, I think I've assumed that it's pretty far out of scope for us to tell BSAC how it distributes its grant programs as part of this. But we have suggested that the model that other states are using to distribute state grants is still an appropriate way to measure affordability for informing the public policy discussion about resource allocation. And that's what we have in here. I would just add that states that distribute the dollars according to this also use the model to think about how to ration the resources that they have that inevitably fall short of meeting full need. And so, for instance, Minnesota has tinkered with the degree of the student contribution amount over the years, as well as tinkering with the recognized cost of the cost of attendance they recognize for the purpose of distributing state grants. So that in states, in years in which they really have way too many applicants or fall too far short, they recognize a slightly lower cost of attendance for the purpose of the distributing grant aid. And then they work with the institution and the institutional grant component to help to try to resolve the remaining gap. And then finally, in Minnesota, as well as in Oregon, there is a difference in what's recognized in terms of the student contribution for 2- and 4-year students. And for 4-year students, there's generally this borrowing requirement expectation that's in there. And again, neither the work nor any borrowing requirement is a requirement that the student either work or borrow. It's just those are used to establish the level that that student on his or her own is expected to bring to the table to cover their cost of attendance if they're enrolled full time. So that was more than sufficient. I saw a whole bunch of people writing comments in here, and now there's some questions up. So Scott, you probably know more about this group than anybody, so why don't you chime in?
I just, Brian, I just wanted to echo something that you said at the outset, which is that there are two ways of looking at this. One is from the policy perspective of trying to identify, what our targets are for overall investments in higher ed from an affordability perspective. And then the second piece is the delivery part, as we talked a little bit about this before. And the observation I wanted to make is that most of the elements that you've described in the shared responsibility model are already embedded within the need analysis that we have developed over the years, kind of for allocating resources. So conceptually, it's not different. We might be picking different different numbers of hours of work are part of what is expected. And I think from our perspective, we can support this as a policy indicator. I'd start to get concerned if we started to tinker too much with need analysis just because of the unintended consequences of playing around with that in the absence of being provided, additional funds. So, from my perspective, I think it's useful to have this as a tool for presenting to the legislature what it is that families are facing. So I like the idea of having this here for that purpose.
Other comments, questions?
Ryan, I would just note that there is so much conversation going on around things like free community college and what states like Tennessee have done in that regard. And the reality is, as you rightly noted, that free community college in Tennessee benefits the lowest income students,
Least.
essentially not at all. The Pell Grant covers, because free community college in Tennessee, first of all, is based on tuition, not cost of attendance. And second of all, it's a last dollar in scholarship. So that if Pell Grants are received by a student, they cover community college tuition in Tennessee, meaning that those funds don't go to the lowest income students at all. And in Tennessee, the cost of tuition is maybe 25% of the cost of attendance for a student. So even the fact that that tuition is covered for lowest income students does not mean that college is affordable. 3/4 of the other costs are left unsupported by those programs. So, I think and I would agree with Scott that, it's not the charge of this group to get into the allocation mechanism at VSAC, but I think it really is useful to have a measure that is recognized in other places. I would add Nevada to this list of states that have thought about this way. We talked with Wyoming about it. We've talked with Utah about it. And SREB, when it talked about affordability, used a model not unlike this as they thought about it for all of their states. So, this is something in a construct that is pretty well recognized. And I think it has real utility for presenting information to policymakers that says, here is the gap for students at different income levels in your institutions, given the way financial aid collectively from the feds, the state, and the institutions are working.
Thank you, Dennis. I think that we would invite separately any additional comments or feedback that you may have on this topic. It's construction. You can see in some of the graphs that that are in this section that that having the data that was provided by the Chancellor's office helps reveal particularly some of the we use Castleton as an example to illustrate the affordability standard depiction here, but we had data we could do that for the other 3 institutions in the system as well. And so it's something that I think is worth monitoring as the legislature tries to respond to changes in its in the state budget and where it wants to make resource allocation decisions, because of course the extent to which the legislature wants to close the affordability gap, they've got multiple ways to do that. One is to enhance state aid, another is to enhance the direct appropriations that help keep tuition in check as well at the institution. So it's a profile and a metric to help track this over time that makes, I think, pretty clear sense to the real budget decisions that people make as they decide about whether or not they're going to be able to afford college.
Yeah, and the only other thing that I would say is that the select committee has made the notion of affordability something that's needs to be addressed and is important in the state, and having some way of measuring how close you are to being affordable in your institutions is pretty fundamental to addressing that priority topic.
Hearing not a lot more to say about this, and Sarah, unless you were about to chime in.
Well, I think what President Garamella noted is also important in that, affordability is such a complicated topic because it really depends on who you're talking to, what their circumstances, and which institution they're attending. I do caution us to not overextend our comments on this in this area of the report, because I don't think it was intended, unless Senator Bruce and Representative James want to say different. I don't think it was really intended to focus as much on affordability as it is about the sustainability of the state college system with consideration to student affordability. I'm just worried that if we put too much weight on this one particular topic, we're kind of just complicating the public conversation that will stem from it, especially if we are trying to limit ourselves just to the state colleges.
I can pick up on that. I do think that the heart of what we were looking at is affordability. I think we've all agreed as a select committee that that's the root of a lot of our problems, is that students can't afford the state college system. So I take all the points I've heard. I think they're things to be deliberated. President Garamella has a point that no institution needs more reporting requirements. With that said, if this section is going to remain, I think it only makes sense to remain as an apples to apples system that we can use in funding higher ed publicly in the state. So I think the debate should be, do we keep it? If we do, then I think having both institutions or UVM and the college system makes sense. So maybe the question is, should we keep it at all? I would favor keeping it. I think it's a good metric, and on balance, probably something that UVM can manage, state colleges can manage in terms of not onerous reporting.
Jeff, you've been very patient with your virtual hand up.
I just wanted to touch on something that Sarah said a little earlier that, you know, sort of resonated with me on both sides of the equation. Actually, three different areas. First, as when I was a student from a middle-class family that attended a state college, right? I was given the opportunity for work study, right? And it was presented to me as an affordability option. But in my reality, I had no way I could fit a work study position into my world. So it's not affordability, right? It's cost defraying. So that was one piece, you know, and I was able to take loans and do some other things and whatever. I got my degree. Moving on into my career in higher ed and recruiting students and doing this, I had such a desire to never want to equate work study with affordability, because it's not what it is. We're defraying costs there. And what it should be considered is what Sarah, I think, was trying to articulate. What I'm seeing on the other side is that's a value statement, right? We should be positioning work study and internship and externship as a value proposition and forcing actual affordability to happen through sustainable practices at the institutions. Now, as an employer who might benefit from a public-private partnership where we're paying a student to be an intern in our organization, I want that student to feel value from my organization, that we're paying that student and that they're committed to our organization, not just, oh, well, I have to do this to fulfill an affordability standard and to meet a certain criteria in order to continue in college. If that makes, you know, I hope that makes some sense. I'm sort of building this plane as I'm flying it, but you get the idea. Like, I think we mix these phrases a lot to suit the audience, and it goes back to President Garamella's kind. Affordability is a complex spectrum, and I don't think we're doing anybody a real service by putting work study in the affordability bucket. That's just from where I sit in a couple of different places. So I just wanted to put that out there. I think we can word it better. I think we can message it better and make it a more substantial piece to a sustainable operation as a whole.
Thank you. Let me just follow that by saying really quickly that I want to make sure that we're being clear when we're clearly not in the draft, that when we talk about this state work study thing, we're talking about a new investment that either is in addition to the current investments in internships, apprenticeships, and the like, or that VSAC would offer in this section, as opposed to the definition of the affordability standard as being 15 to 18 or so hours of work per week, as a way to understand the point at which students working beyond that and enrolling full-time are going to struggle to be their best in their educational pursuits. And the degree that these if I'm hearing them getting conflated at all, that's our fault for not crafting the language in the right places to make sure that that's clear.
Yeah, and it could be completely the way I'm internalizing it, Brian. I'm perfectly, it could just be a me thing, right? But I do think we should make clear, because I've seen in conversations with students recruiting young women to come to Castleton and play basketball, like, it was hard to you couldn't even get to that point of the conversation, right? Because they couldn't see past an actual sticker price.
Yeah.
Right. To get to the affordability conversation, it was already an insurmountable leap for them to make. So I think part of what our charge could and should be is how do we create a simple message around that really, really complex spectrum of affordability.
Yeah, let me, just in the interest of time, if it's all right with you, Joyce, Scott's got his hand up. I'd like to give him the last word on this topic so he can move on. I just would say that affordability's complexities, I mean, our point of view is that, yes, all that's true about affordability. It's very complex. All the more reason, to some respect, for the policymakers who are making the decisions that actually generate the results we're seeing to have some kind of information and a framework for understanding how those decisions play out in the real world. And so we'll try to do better. The state work study is an element to try to help achieve the affordability standard, but not to be this mixed up in the same sort of context. So I've got some work to do to rearrange how this works, and still some conversations to have around how to integrate that with the other stuff that the state's already funding around that. But Scott, if you'll make your comments, I want to make sure that we have time to talk about some of these other things that we tried to be responsive to in your feedback.
Sure. So I'll be brief. And the observation that I wanted to make was in part in response to what Jeff was saying, and I appreciated, the interchange between the two of you and the clarification, because within need analysis, there's always some component of self-help, and drawing out the difference between what you're thinking about in terms of the work study component or that work component is a something that is separate from that conversation about self-help, I think is going to be helpful. My closing comment is that right now, the only proxy we use for this is student debt. And, we have not been particularly successful in the legislature using that as an indicator of the burden that families are facing. So while sensitive to all the complexities, because we have a very targeted need analysis process, I think that when the things that you've done in the past aren't working, it's a great opportunity to take the opportunity to try something a little bit different. So I want to, embrace this as, another tool for communicating with folks about affordability. The second thing I wanted to just ask, you've got some recommendations down there with regard recommendations that the legislature take a look at. And some of them are with regard to the grant program, and there may be some misconceptions regarding the way it's structured. And I don't know if you want to discuss those in this context or whether that would be best just some editorial comments coming back electronically. I'm happy to go either way.
Can we do the latter, and maybe if we need to get on the phone, we can do that, Scott, just so that we can make sure we've had time to talk about some of these other things. Please. Sure. All right. I'm taking Joyce's silence as assent that I can move on.
Yes, but there is one question I think we, and I don't know that we want to debate this now, but I think it, and it goes back to the comments that Suresh made, and it goes back to the comments that Kathleen made in terms of this, and it actually goes back to the original charge. If you look at the title of our committee, and then you look at the charge, they're a little bit different. One is the public, I'm just paraphrasing because I don't have in front of me, is, the future of public higher ed in Vermont. And then the charge is very specifically related to the Vermont State Colleges. And so I think that I happen to appreciate what President Garamella is talking about in terms of, either UVM's in the report or they're not in the report. But in some places and not in some places, I think gets confusing. I agree that if we think about, and from a legislative standpoint, I appreciate Representative James's comments about, I'd like it in. I think that what's confusing to me is either we agree that these are examples for the very specifically targeting the Vermont State Colleges. And in the end, it might be good for all of public higher ed in Vermont, but let's not confuse the issue in terms of sometimes we're bringing UVM in, sometimes we're not. And that's where I would love, and maybe people can share comments with Brian, or if they have some immediate comments. It feels like it gets a little confusing, and I can defend both sides. But I think we as a committee need to either say, okay, we recognize that public higher education in Vermont includes this broad spectrum, and UVM is part of that. But this, for purposes of this report to the legislature, and maybe I should ask Senator Baruth and Representative James to weigh in, because in the end, this is most important for their audience, is it helpful for us to really zero in on the Vermont State Colleges? And our recommendations really specifically speak to the Vermont State Colleges, but recognize that in the end, it might be good for all of public higher ed. But rather than debate that now, we're just going to work on the Vermont State Colleges. I would just be interested in your feedback around that, because I think there are places, a number of places where we could bring UVM into the conversation, and for the most part, we've kept them out and focused just on the Vermont State Colleges. So I would just be curious.
I'll respond. You might remember at the beginning of our discussions, I favored keeping UVM out to a large extent of this report. In other words, that we focus on the state colleges, their immediate financial problems, et cetera. This is the one area where I feel like from the legislative perspective, you cannot make a decision in isolation about the state colleges. It is always, practically speaking, a three-way decision. Every appropriations decision is state colleges, UVM, and VSAC, and the relative proportions among those, and then the different budgets, the institution's budget, the general fund, et cetera. So this is the one place where I feel like it would be, that's why I framed it as, I think either we shouldn't have an affordability standard, but it doesn't make sense to develop one for one of those entities when in fact every decision is, VSAC is a more minor component of that, but it's always with, both hands weighing state colleges and UVM in terms of need. If we had this apples to apples measure, it seems to me that it would be useful only if we were doing it with both systems, which is why I framed it as, should we have it at all? So I hear what you're saying, Joyce. It's, I wouldn't call it confusing, but this is an area where we do something we wouldn't do elsewhere in the report. But I don't think anybody will be confused by this result. That's my opinion. Kathleen, do you have a?
I agree. So I don't have a whole lot to add. I think this is a very useful section. I think it'll be extremely useful for the legislature. And I think that Senator Baruth made a cogent argument. So I don't have a whole lot to add. I'd like to keep this in and keep UVM in this context.
All right, well, we still have close to a month left before we have to submit this next report. And I do have some work to do on a portion of this at the very least, but we'll, I think this is a conversation we'll continue to work a little bit on as we go forward. Is that all right? Can we?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, proceed.
All right, thank you. The second one I want to talk about is the estimates of the cost of inaction. This was a good, I think it was a relatively clear instruction from all of you to try to develop signs of what might happen in the absence of substantial action by the legislature. And so for reference, there are two places where this sort of gets fleshed out, a little bit repetitive, but I couldn't figure out how to make it work perfectly in just at one place. So on page, I think 18 of the red line version, there's a discussion of the cost of inaction. And then also on page 45 of the resource allocation discussion, we are articulating our best estimates, which are not really ours, but they come from work that's been done by the system office of closing the campus. There is, in addition to that, an unknown fiscal impact of the actually closing it on jobs, on the community, on so forth. And really useful to point out, I think, in here is there's a statement in a sentence that says, in addition to a closure of a campus estimated to be somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars, you would incur all of those costs without the benefit of tuition revenue from that campus now closed would generate. And that's probably I think in our estimation, those were fairly conservative on the low side cost of closure. I am interested in knowing if this is sufficiently responsive to the thing that you all were looking for in this document.
I really liked these additions. You know, I think it was a $19 million estimate of what it would cost to close a campus, with the follow-on idea that it wouldn't be providing any benefits, would just be a drain on resources. I really do think that helps make the case for acting, you know, aggressively now. So I appreciate it and support those.
I'm especially glad to hear that from you, Senator, since I think you were the driving force behind the inclusion of these. But did anybody else have any feedback? Anything that's confusing or could be clarified about it at all?
What's the definition of short-term to middle term, medium term?
So in the estimations that we were able to get access to, the $19 million figure was for closing NVU entirely and selling off all of its real estate assets within a year. And then there were direct costs related to a number of things. And I think that was over about 6 fiscal years, with the bulk of those costs being earlier. The $13 million figure was an estimate that was created a couple of years ago, and it was for closing the Linden campus, we believe, by itself. And it's probably a safer estimate for one campus. And I think that the time frame was roughly similar. But this is of course a little bit hard to judge because it's unclear how quickly you could get rid of the buildings and offload the utilities costs and the cost of securing the space, the cost of the land and so forth, as well as how difficult to assess would be what additional costs there would be on the other remaining institutions to develop and implement teach-out plans for the students who would be wrapped up in it. Ultimately, we're talking about a very substantial amount relative to the VSC budgets to close any one campus, and you're also reducing the revenue side of the picture at the same time.
I think it's probably safe to say that if anything, these numbers are on the low side, because there are some, as Brian just mentioned, there are some things that don't have specific dollar numbers associated with them that will inevitably creep into this if a campus were to be closed. You're not going to sell all the buildings in a year. That will drag on. There are some subsidiary costs of contracts that may be out there that have to be paid, and et cetera. So
this is Sandy. May I contribute?
Sure.
I really like this section. Thank you so much for adding to it. And I was pleased to see the discussion about the economic impact. What I would like to see more of is the impact to society and the ongoing impact to Vermont on multi-generational poverty. That's a huge, affecting that is a huge outcome of our Vermont State College system. And I don't think this passionately talks about that financial impact to our state 5, 10, 15, 30 years down the road. So yes, the numbers are good, the words are good. There needs to be more passion around what it means to the people of the state. if we don't have these schools in place, and the cost because of that.
Representative James, you've been patiently waiting with your hand up.
Thanks. I was just going to say, I realize this is becoming the ever expanding report, but at the bottom of page 18, top of page 19, when it talks about the pain while also robbing the community and the region of a critical engine for economic recovery, unless it's elsewhere in the report, and it might be because it is many pages, that might be an excellent place to just add a couple of paragraphs even about the economic contribution of the Vermont state colleges to the Vermont economy and to the regions in which they're located. I know I've seen those reports and have those numbers somewhere, and you could even put in 2 paragraphs right there about how much they are currently contributing, not just to the statewide economy, but to the communities in which the campuses are located. Thanks.
Thank you. Sarah, did I see you put your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to actually make a comment in the opposite, trying to advance an opposite policy, which is to take those paragraphs out, in part because I know, especially in my world and our work of rapid response with layoffs and the downsizing of many employers across the state in the last couple of, well, the last year now, I think it's really difficult to, I think we're opening up a whole, when we begin to try to quantify the impact of a state college closure in a community, the closing of the campus in the community, and we talk about the economic impact on that town, I just wonder if that's even possible right now, given the dramatic changes in our economy over the last year. And I just worry that any either numbers or characterization of the impact will be dismissed as out of date. And so I would not object to keeping them in, but I just question whether there really is anything that we can say with any degree of certainty about that isn't just speculative about the economic impact in the community. And I did feel like the language around it was a little bit this is going to evoke a lot of emotions anyway, and I just felt that the way, I'm trying to find it now, the short-term impact will come with substantial pain while also robbing the community and the region of critical engine for economic recovery. That just feels a little bit explosive for my taste in terms of characterizing what a physical plant closure might do. And I also wonder, I think to Sandy's point, again, not to be critical of that, I also wonder if we can really say what the difference is between physically closing a space, if we're consolidating the educational opportunities and providing a more expansive way to access all of the educational opportunities across different campuses in the state college system in the state of Vermont. And so I wonder if, again, with the changes that have occurred and post-secondary education in the last year, if we are almost dating ourselves by trying to continue to describe what a physical closure of a space would be, when in fact we may be opening up a whole new way of providing post-secondary learning opportunities that aren't space dependent. And that's not to diminish, again, that there will be economic impacts, but I feel a little uncomfortable with us almost arguing vehemently against even exploring the possibility of closing some physical plants when we're also recommending that we are asking this colleges to explore the way that they are delivering education.
But
I think your point's well taken. I would just want to clarify that when I read this, how I'm interpreting it is closing institution means virtual or not.
Okay.
So
in my mind, I don't see any part of our report, unless I'm really off base here, that is closing an institution. Again, I think this is all about combining and unifying the educational opportunities. So that is important. If that is what we're saying, I can see your point very much, Sandy.
Yeah, but just a reminder that what we're talking about here is the cost of inaction. And what that means, if you don't do anything, if VSC does not reform itself, if it doesn't get the investment necessary to reform itself, then campus closure in this sense is inevitable. And I think that's what this set of paragraphs is trying to say. It's not, that if you downsize campuses and et cetera, that's in the context of a unified university, that's one thing. But if you don't do anything and just say it's going to be business as usual and a downward death spiral, there are still real economic costs associated with that, and you better recognize them.
Okay. Sophie?
Thanks. I just wanted to add a couple of things. And one is that we do know that we have students that are place bound. So closing a physical space will have an impact. And I think it will have an impact on intergenerational poverty as well, that we do have students that simply won't be served if we're not physically present in some parts of the state. So I just want to put that point out there because I think it's important to remember. The other piece, just, I think you guys all understand, but I just wanted to make clear that we are one corporation. So our 4 institutions are all linked together. So when we talk about, closure of a particular campus, for example, it has a domino impact on the remaining institutions. It's not like we can isolate one individual institution. So I think you understand that. I think that's reflected in the report, but I just wanted to make sure that that was clearly understood, that all those costs, personnel costs, retiree health benefits, debt service, carrying costs of a campus then get shunted over to the remaining institutions and then further jeopardize their sustainability. So it's not as if we can close one portion and sort of limit the damage that way.
Yep. Dan.
Yeah, Sophie just kind of took my thunder a little bit, but I think a physical space is extremely important for many of our students. It's a safe place. It's a way to get out of a bad situation. I mean, I think about what happened this fall where, we had students who stayed on campus because they had no other way to go. I'm not saying we need to be the same size we are now, but a physical campus where students develop their own community connections with those other people is extremely important in any size or any capacity. So, there is extreme value in having that physical presence, I believe.
Gotcha. Okay. Anyone else? Any further comment on this section, these sections? We have some I think, very doable adjustments to make. Sarah, don't feel shy about telling me that my language was too explosive. There's a lot of language in this long report, and picking one part out as being problematic is hardly a difficult task. So anyway, the third area that I wanted to talk about was the additional content related to the unification. There's a bunch of stuff in here related to this. A lot of this has to do with some of the feedback we've received is questioning the inclusion of VTC in the unified institution. What we've tried to do is be a little clearer than we were in the December report about where the funding levels or where the savings / reinvestment of funds opportunities derive from in terms of expenditure categories in comparison to peers. We've also tried to provide some case studies of relevant institutional consolidations that include institutions that are more generally technical in nature, like VTC, along with institutions that are more generally liberal arts and or former normal colleges with heavy educational programs, as cases that provide lessons on how to do this or how not to do this. We have also, in response to concerns about the table that was the subject of so much discussion prior to the December report, which I think is was figure 10. Now it's on, shoot. It's on page 46 of the redline version. This was an attempted, we were instructed to try to provide some analysis of how we got to some of the expectations for revenue that comes from added enrollment. And I want to kind of take it from where you guys it makes the most sense for you guys to chime in on the changes we made. I would just say about that latter piece, I want to highlight, and hopefully it's done in writing, but that we are trying to differentiate tuition revenue that BSC might be able to get out of its projected low point in enrollment, hopefully for fiscal year 21, and gathering or being able to recapture some of the students who did not enroll in college because of COVID. So the bulk of those additional tuition dollars would come from gradually over time attracting the students that BSC institutions have historically been able to enroll back to their campuses after this very unusual, we hope, period. And then there's a tiny little bit of additional tuition revenue from broadening outreach via better affordability policies and a more focused set of outreach activities to adult learners from those groups. In the latter two cases, and actually in all three cases of sources of tuition revenue dollars, we're not talking about large numbers of students. In the first case with the COVID returnees, we're actually assuming that BSC's enrollment won't actually ever reach the high point in fiscal year 18 or 19, but come within 5 or 8% below of that level. And in the other case, for recent high school grads, we're having done the WICHE high school graduates report in a prior life. I'm quite aware that Vermont's demographic picture is not bright for high school graduates, but it still has among the lower half of the states in college going rates. And so with better affordability, perhaps better outreach to those student populations would yield a little additional revenue. And there we're talking about, tens and teens of students, not very many overall. So I invite folks to offer feedback on any and all of those subjects. So take it away. Who wants to start? Hopefully it didn't overwhelm everybody. All right, Representative James.
Thanks. I guess I would just want to have reassurance from the state colleges that they feel that these numbers are realistic and achievable, even though they've been clearly defined as, a lot more incremental and small. I always get nervous when I see an assumption in a report like this that says something like, we will do it better, which is, kind of what it says on page 47, that we'll do kind of better outreach, better retention. And once we do things better, things will get better. And so that just makes me a little bit nervous because I just assumed that if there were an easier way to do it better, that would have already been happening.
I agree. And just to underscore that, the reference to the, was a 2% uptake in Vermont high school graduates attending state colleges would make a difference. I don't have it right here in front of me, but I do recall there was a, sort of a specific citation there. And I
Yeah,
wonder
like
if we're at the point where there's no more low-hanging fruit.
I don't know, Sophie, if you want to respond to it, I will respond from a CCV perspective. I think although CCV's enrollment has been really stable and pretty strong this year, different than the other schools, I think any report that assumes that we will have any growth gives me great pause, because I think that you're right. Doing things better, increasing retention rates, increasing college going rates, those are really stubborn figures. And we've been working at this for a while. And so it does give, we can't look into the, into the future and say, the numbers that we saw pre-COVID that people will come back. There's pent up energy to do this. You can read both sides. And so I think Representative James, you raise a very good issue. It gives me pause. And this is coming from a CCV institution that has held its own very well in the past year. And so I think it's a very fair question.
I would just say that we did have a conversation with Brian about the numbers and having the clarification that we were talking about additional students on top of the very low, the low enrollments that we have for this year, that we weren't talking about, on top of previous numbers. I do know, and I don't know if it's in here, but one of the concerns I have is that we do know that there's a cliff on the on enrollment that will be coming as a result of the 2008 recession, that there are, I think it's 2026 when that hits, which is just at the end of the 5 years that are sort of talked about in the report. So I would be cognizant of that moving forward, that the picture will get more challenging once we get to 2026.
Dan?
Yeah, I would just like that. I mean, I agree. I think it's a risky business to kind of project this, but something we've talked about before too is everything is all intertwined. It's kind of like the dog chasing its tail, in the sense that if we can somehow improve efficiency and affordability, I don't want to go back to that discussion, but affordability, then we've seen that there is a direct correlation between tuition costs and the number of people who enroll. A much stronger correlation than between demographics and enrollment, at least in Vermont. So if we can somehow control the tuition idea, it is reasonable to believe that we will see increased enrollment. But again, we're in this endless cycle. I think, how do we if we do A, then B, but if we do B, then A, I think it's complicated and it's very risky. But I think we have to keep in mind that there are other factors in here that could control or help shape enrollment projections and numbers, and besides the fact that we have 2% more high school graduates.
So Heather, you had your hand up.
So I need a reminder, because I can't recall, and I apologize, whether these analyses took into account that we are not going to have demographically more high school seniors. We are actually going to continue to have less high school seniors as a state, unless things drastically change in terms of broader economic initiatives or help, having families actually move here with younger students. So I can't recall if that was already built into the analyses. And if not, then I would echo the concerns, because we would be even with all of the tuition initiatives and so on and so forth, we would need to make sure that's above and beyond, because we're going to be actually tapping from a smaller and smaller traditional student pool?
Yeah, so I can answer that very quickly. And the Sophie's got it right. The cliff that Vermont is facing, you probably feel like you've been sliding down a cliff for a while, but the real cliff is right after 2026 or 27. Actually, between now and then, at least Wichie's projections anticipate that Vermont's going to have about the same number of high school graduates emerging from the state's high schools, you know, on average over that period. They'll be up and down, but actually looking at the data right now, 2025, you're actually supposed to have a little bit of a spike, a huge spike by Vermont standards. So
every year though, Brian, from different data, every year our school enrollments go down, and that's across every grade. Yes,
and you know, I know Wichie's methodology really well. When I built these projections, I would receive phone calls from New Hampshire. Seriously, it was New Hampshire, I'm not just using them as a proxy for Vermont in this case, calling me and saying, these projections are not precise enough. We really need to know exactly how many there are. So there's a lot of, and the further out you go, the more, as with any projections, squirrely the data get. If you want us to use a different source, then we're happy to try to do that. But for the period of time we're talking about, it's supposed to go from about 6,400 to 6,500 down to 6,300 up to 6,700. And those all the methodology factors in the changes from year to year in the 12th grade enrollment, from the 11th grade enrollment, from the 10th grade enrollment, all the way down to births. That's the methodology. So I think the intent here for this section was to do three things. One is the revenue increase that we're trying to put into the table is as close an estimate to a gradual return of students lost to this COVID episode over a period of time. That there's no model for that. So we basically kind of assumed that there would be a gradual return with first-time students coming back in larger numbers, then them becoming second-year students with another cohort arriving on the scene. Then the second piece is this high school graduate population. And for that, we're talking about teens of students across all four institutions, not large numbers, but because you've got so much of your revenue wrapped up in tuition, you actually at average tuition rates, you actually see a benefit from enrolling one or more students. Conversely, you see a real cost when you can't. So we're doing the best we can to assess that there's a slight improvement in outreach, in part driven by better affordability policy that's embedded in this paper, that stops at about 2026 or 27 because of the cliff effect that we're talking about. If we don't have that right, we're we just, I guess, can be accused of not having great crystal balls. But I think that, and the other piece, which is the returning adults, one of the things we're trying to suggest is that the state's making an investment in Vermont State College, not just to prop up Vermont State colleges so that they're around down the line, but they're actually making an investment to make a meaningful difference in the way in which the Vermont State colleges operate, that is going to have the results of very slightly improvements in accessibility, retention, affordability, all of which are related. And in the absence of that, we could, if it's the considered decision of the select committee, I'm perfectly fine with zeroing out those tuition revenue recaptures and then assuming that Sophie and her team will be able to wring all of those additional dollars out of their structural deficit. But the intent of this was to try to articulate a mix of improved benefits because of the investment the state is making in the Vermont State colleges, and to do it in a way that's not completely unreasonable from the perspective of the institutions. if we've got that wrong, then we can make some adjustments to it.
I'd like to contribute if that's possible. What I'm hearing is a frame of the traditional student, and as services are generally being delivered today. And as an employer, I just keep seeing great opportunity with my students. We're not stagnant, and we need support from our educational institutions to retool our people every 3 or 4 years. And I look forward to growth in that market space, which might help this situation. So don't forget, there's other organizations that need you badly that aren't being fully touched upon today.
And that's the one we did. That's also in there. It's the one we didn't talk about very much, but there's an expectation that better services to employers and to adults will yield revenue in addition as well. And with that revenue kind of growing over time as VSC makes this transition and becomes more adept at serving those populations. Which is not to say they're doing everything wrong, right? It's just, trying to steer the organization to be even more impactful than it already is.
Life is dynamic. It's responding to a new emergence.
So I have 2 people with their hands up. One of them I can tell is Representative James. The other one I can't see.
It's Scott.
Okay. Yeah, Representative James, you want to go first since I could actually see your hand up?
Yep, sure. Just quickly, so I guess I'd say that I would just need to be better reassured that the retention of trads in particular, you feel confident about. And if that's due to the affordability, you think, that if by addressing affordability that the traditional age students will stay and that retention will be addressed. It's the retention piece. I mean, I'm nervous about all of it, but the retention in particular, I guess I would just want to see further fleshed out why better retention is going to flow from this. And if the answer is affordability, great.
So trying to respond to that, there's only so much that we can do with the data we have available in the timeline we have to generate greater precision on such small numbers. I think there's a couple of things. One is there is a relationship between affordability and retention. I think what we've heard, this isn't data driven specifically, but what we've heard from the conversations we've had with folks around Vermont virtually is that there's a quality issue that's growing within VSC because there's too few faculty and too many disciplines where an individual is expected to learn too much from too few people. And if we're able to change the way in which, if you all are able to change the way in which Vermont State Colleges approaches the delivery of certain kinds of programs, I can imagine that the students will recognize that they're getting a better experience from multiple sources from more faculty than they were under the current structure. That would have some effects on retention. I know of no studies that can tell you what the magnitude of an impact of improved quality is on retention. But it is, I think, reasonable to expect that given the opportunity and the investment by the state to really rethink how delivery is happening, you should expect retention to improve. And in order to get to some of these numbers, neither retention nor outreach has to improve by very much. The real issue is whether the pool of students is there.
And just in that regard, pardon me, Scott, for jumping in ahead of you, that one of the things that was noted early on is that the college going rate in Vermont is very low by any national standards. So affordability ought to impact that particular number, and that regardless of the fact that there won't be any more high school graduates. or there in fact will be fewer of them. The fact that so many of those students don't go anywhere to college still remains a pool to be tapped. And one can, I think, make a legitimate argument that it's the affordability that keeps many of those students from not going on to college anywhere.
Scott, you've been very patient.
Yeah, I think there are just kind of two data related points that I want to make, and appreciated Dennis's observation, because I'm torn between what the data is going to, what I'm going to say about data and, my mission related commitment to the proposition that part of the solution is increasing the continuation rates. And just two data related observations. One is that if we disaggregate the college going rates between students that are pursuing two-year educations at two-year institutions and four-year institutions, we end up above the national average at our four-year college going rate, but well below the national average in our two-year college going rate, using both kind of New England data, clearinghouse data. And that analysis is this, AOE did a similar study kind of looking at that. And so I think as we think about this, it's important for us to be just, cognizant of where the targets of opportunity may be. They may not be across the institutions that, that have the greatest need. And then the other observation I want to make, just based on some research that we just dropped out, which highlights the importance of the investment in program, is that when we take a look at graduation rates for class of 2012, academic preparation is actually having a bigger impact than their financial aid or their economics, which was not entirely what we were expecting. And so, part of the challenge that the state colleges will face in the absence of resources is the support that is required in order to be able to kind of retain, that target group of students, kind of across the board. So as I think about this, I just want to make those 2 points, that when we lump our college going rate together, it masks something that Joyce and I have talked about, kind of extensively over the last couple of years. And then that second point, that affordability is critically important, but academic preparation appears right now to be the bigger factor in retention.
I would just echo what Scott said. I mean, that's my understanding of our data as well. This is Heather. It's really the strongest predictor is academic preparation.
Which doesn't mean that I'm not committed to getting every student we can get.
Absolutely.
So that makes me wonder if there are some policies that the state has advanced in the last several years, like the flexible pathways and dual enrollment, early college, et cetera, that focus in that way, might be policies that we want to note as good to continue. Like if we're trying to, maybe we want to say, don't stop implementing or continuing to expand upon those policies, in addition to saying, in the words of Representative James, do more. But we have to at least continue to do what we know is tending to work.
Quick question.
Yep, go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm taking notes madly.
Talking about demographics, do we know where the students are coming from? What percentage are from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire?
Only for first-time students.
So
at least that's what I have.
What does that look like?
Mostly from New York and Massachusetts when they're not from Vermont. I'm trying to remember, but it's it might be in the report. It's in one of the slide decks we sent before, but if I can't remember specifically, then no, there's no reason to expect that you would be able to, Steve. But yeah, that's the nearby states primarily.
So what's the vulnerability from a competitive model of those other states really trying to keep those students within those states.
Likely growing.
Well, that was my whole point when I talked about the big billboard I saw down in Hartford. So I don't think there's, I think it's wishful thinking that you're going to sustain even what you have right now for students in the system.
That's why when we built this out, we expected, not entirely why, but partly why we expected that Vermont state colleges wouldn't necessarily return all the way to their fiscal year 18 or 19 enrollment levels, that issue, as well as the extent to which I guess when I was putting this together, I was reflecting on the fact that were we to be dealing with this particular project in 5 years from now, we'd be talking about negative numbers in these cells. So even if we are assuming that retention improves and that college going rates among Vermont residents improves, because of the decline in the number of high school graduates, unless we were to get all of those individuals out of the adult workforce, then those numbers would likely start to fall after fiscal year 26. Right now, there's an opportunity while high school graduates are relatively stable in Vermont to do better outreach among those populations. And the analysis that I pulled together here assumes that these additional enrollments among high school graduates and adults is all Vermont residents. And it attempts to try to understand what the revenue that Vermont residents would be contributing to the bottom line, not non-residents from elsewhere. The COVID response part includes non-residents as well. But I'm trying to assume that Vermont state colleges are first and foremost there for the benefit of Vermonters. And so better outreach to that population, both for traditional age students and for adults, would generate very modest additional revenue implications. But as I said before, if folks are uncomfortable, like I said, we talked with Sophie and her team about this. It's an attempt to try to be somewhat reasonable and reflect the fact that the investment of $48 million is going to generate some improvements that are reflected in some of these numbers and will also generate its own revenue. But if it's more than the select committee believes is reasonable, it just means that the structural deficit has to be closed by even deeper cuts in the Vermont state colleges themselves.
Well, I think we're seeing in healthcare a real paradigm shift of probably brought on by COVID, obviously, but I think we're going to see it for a long time, is the shift to telehealth. So if you're really not focused on online learning, I think that's going to be a bigger problem. And it's not going to be in bricks and mortar. And, we're focused from healthcare again, and most hospitals are seeing either a 10 to 20% drop in volumes. And the question is that the new normal? We don't know, because we're not through it yet. But we've seen as much of an increase in on the telehealth side.
Right, and I think that the analogy built in here, and this is where I think we start to tread closer to where the Vermont State College Board's roles and responsibilities are, is making shifts in the delivery model, like what you're talking about, that make it possible to serve more students more efficiently, and with fewer costly employees as well. So I guess I'll stop there. Heather?
Yeah, I really appreciate this discussion. I would not recommend not keeping this section or redoing your analyses. That's not the reason I brought this up, but I think perhaps a more robust discussion of the certainty of conclusions, the limitations of the approach would satisfy me. I think that's more what I'm looking for, because I don't think we have time to go back and search for some magical data set, which probably doesn't exist. And B, I think, you know, these are good data. There's just other pieces we might want to actually note that might have an impact that can't be included in these analyses.
Thank you, Heather. I really appreciate all the attention to the work that I spent some time on last week that you all gave this. I hope I haven't sounded like that everything makes perfect sense and is fully clear in here, because of course it's crystal balling a little bit of the future. I would like folks to comment before we run out of time on the other pieces of the discussion related to the unification. The case studies, for example, any of the other data that are in this section that are new. We're almost up to the time where we want to make sure we've got, we hear from any public comment that we need to, notwithstanding the changes that Joyce mentioned before. But anyway, so I want to make sure that folks who were ready to weigh in on that have a chance to do so. So either that means that everything that was written in there was above all reproach, or you don't know what to make of it, or it was at least minimally met the expectations that you had outlined for us. Sophie.
Yeah, I would just say we did have a very interesting discussion with many of our trustees on Friday regarding the December 4th report, and the inclusion of Vermont Technical College was certainly a big topic of discussion on that. I don't know if there are any case studies or anything that would be helpful with respect to including VTC in a unified accreditation regarding the ability. I think there's a concern about the loss of identity for Vermont Tech, and a concern about its, what it provides, its value proposition with regard to the hands-on and experiential learning. But if you had any examples of things where you had either a system or a common accreditation where you within that entity you can highlight the technical programs. I mean, I'm thinking that there would be nothing to preclude a combined entity from marketing its technical programs, or identifying, and I think you had talked previously about having the College of, whatever, or centers of excellence, within the system. But if you had any additional information about that, I think it may help address a lot of the concerns that have been raised around inclusion of Vermont Tech in a consolidated entity with the other two universities.
Yeah, and in response to that, so this whole section that relates to these case studies was written since we became aware that there was concern or questions about the integration of Vermont Tech into the other two. So these, to the extent that we were able to, in a week's time or so, sift through our collective memories of relevant cases that might include, these were the ones that we came up with. It's a little bit of a challenge because Vermont Tech is an unusual institution in the country. There are certainly our technical schools at the 2- and 4-year level. There are not nearly as many that are so heavily, that have such an even, roughly even share. It's not even, but it's a big chunk of programs at the baccalaureate level and a big chunk of other programs at the 2-year level, with a lot of laddering between them. So I think that VTC's questioning, or the board's curiosity about how to resolve this, is a good question and worth the time. The best examples that we could come up with are in short order included in here, including the merger of Kennesaw State University and Southern Polytechnic State University. Although SPSU in that was a 4-year granting institution, a baccalaureate granting institution. So I think I said in the steering group meeting the other day that I was reluctant to put any case studies on the table at that point, because as soon as I did, somebody would say, well, that's not a very good case study because of this. And that's inevitably the case, but there are lessons to be learned. Snow College in Utah, for instance, was basically handed an applied technical center 20-something years ago, and on a different campus, and they've maintained a relatively stark difference between the two campuses that institution operates. There are lessons there. I'm not convinced, having spent time at Snow College within the last couple of years, that is the best approach. But it's one they took, and there's trade-offs back and forth to how that worked. But they still are offering technical programs at that institution on the original campus that it occupied. So so anyway, there, that, I guess that's my response to that. But thank you for contributing that thought, Sophie.
Yeah, and I do see that you have a lot of that information in there. I did just want to let you know that definitely is something that was discussed quite intensively on Friday. So
yes, and they had not had a chance to see any of this at that point either.
Right.
And there are examples of institutions, and we point to Weber State in Utah as an institution that does a very good job of doing both the 2- and 4-year technical programs and having a set of liberal arts and science programs as well. I mean, they have managed for a lot of years, as a matter of fact, to make that institution work with multiple missions.
And on the other side of the state, there's another institution that is structured or was built to be very similar to Weber State that has not made that same level of commitment and has moved further away from its technical college, or the portion of its origins that came out of that. So there is a real need within the unified institution that emerges out of this, if these recommendations are implemented, for engaged leadership to ensure that the technical college mission is preserved in ways that serve the goals of the state.
Brian, I want to be mindful of time, and I do want to make sure we leave time for two things. One, an update on the stakeholder engagement plans, because I know that Candace and you have worked on that. And also, I just want to check back with Joyce to ask her if there's been any questions. So how about we do the stakeholder update, and then we'll just finish up with if I don't believe Joyce has received any questions. I think she's received some comments that will be posted, but we can check back with her. But do we want to go to the stakeholder engagement activities? Candace, do you want to give us an update on that?
Yeah, sure. So this week we are finalizing dates for 3 focus groups that will take place during the week of the 25th. 2 of them will be a mix of people representing business, community, and workforce development leaders. And the 3rd group will be what I've been calling other education and training providers. So representatives from K-12 schools, technical centers, and some other sort of state leaders on education. We'd love to have your participation in those focus groups to obviously give you an opportunity to hear directly from various folks, but also to represent some of your thoughts about the report thus far. So we will send you the invitations, the Zoom links, the dates, and the agendas and questions. Of course, the invitee list as well for each of those focus groups. And if you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to reach out.
Candice, will those be recorded? I'm just thinking it may be of benefit for our trustees to have access to review the external stakeholder or focus group conversations.
Yes, I think we can record those. They may also be subject to public meeting rules. I want to double check on that as well. But I think it's reasonable to make those discussions public, but I welcome others' thoughts. So I also want to provide space for people to be very honest as well.
And Candace, I also, and correct me if I'm wrong, although you're inviting our attendants, the focus is to hear from others during the focus group. So I think what I would ask our committee members is this is a chance to listen, to hear what the public and different entities are saying, as opposed to us being an active participant. Is that fair, Candace?
Yeah, and I think there would be an opportunity to respond to any questions, but I think that's totally on the mark.
And typically we've tried to put together summaries as well. So if there's, if that's helpful for your purposes, Sophie, we can certainly do that as well.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, do we want to, Brian, is it okay to turn this over to Joyce, and then we'll go back to you for final comments? Joyce, do you have some questions?
We got no questions, but we did get 2 comments. One just came in from Pat Moulton at Vermont Tech, and she's wondering about looking at cases where an institution like Vermont Tech has been merged with a liberal arts college rather than having been born that way, as she says. And we also got a comment earlier in the day from a professor at NVU, and that has to do with documenting the savings from the unification as suggested in the report. So just more clarification on that. That's it. Oh no, I think we have another new one.
Okay.
We have 2 more new ones. One has to do with the shared affordability standard, asking about, does this really generate new enrollments? And another from Pat Moulton asking if she can get a list of invitees to the focus groups and or provide ideas on whom to invite.
I think I will respond to the who to invite. We collected names from the select committee and a pretty broad diversity. So I think those committees, those groups are pretty set, Pat. However, you can reach out to them and share the report and ask anybody that you want to provide our group with comments. But I guess I would turn to Candace. I think the groups are pretty established based on the input you received from the select group. Is that right, Candace?
Yeah, that's right. And this is sort of an opportunity to hear from people who don't necessarily represent higher education. We did hear from a lot of higher education institutional constituencies from our first round of focus groups in November.
Great. So Brian, I will turn this back to you for a final comment. Just as my final comment is, just remember for select committee members, our next meeting will be February 8th. You will be receiving keep your eyes out for stuff from Candace, because again, we are working under a pretty tight timeline. For the second report is due on February 12th. And so we're going to need, Brian will be sending out occasionally perhaps different iterations or comments, or we are looking for feedback from this group. So please just pay attention to emails that you get from Candace asking you for information, because this is our way to keep moving this forward without having formal meetings. So we want to respect your time. And we know we've asked a lot of you, but we do need to keep this moving forward. So there will be more to come. And I would turn this over to Brian for final thoughts.
Great, and I would just say a couple things. One is we didn't get around to talking about any of the two buckets that I mentioned at the outset that we made some changes to, perceptions of a larger chancellor's office and the graduate program. So if anybody who wanted to weigh in on the language that we used in those sections, I welcome that separately. I think that unless you all have a big objection, what I intend to do is, like I've been doing before, I'm going to go into this red line version, accept all of the edits that are in there, and then begin making subsequent ones that are responsive to the feedback we've received. So you'll see a cleaner version that has new red lines in it. As I collect those and put those together, we'll ship them off in time for the next select group meeting, as we have been doing. I want to respond to President Moulton's comment, just that we are continuing to sift through possible case studies, but the version that we sent out on Friday does include, we mentioned Weber and the other institution in Utah. In addition, the merger of which those two were actual institutions that were born as they are. The merger of Kennesaw State and SPSU, Southern Polytechnic State University, is a case that in which the technical college was merged into what is now what remains Kennesaw State University, with two campuses, and maintains an emphasis on those technical programs. That happened within the last 5 years. So there is at least one case that we've identified in there for folks to take a look at, as well as the acquisition in Utah of the College of Eastern Utah, a 2-year technical college, into the Utah State University, which, as everyone probably knows, is the land grant institution there, where the formerly College of Eastern Utah is maintaining the program array, more or less, that it had, I believe, when it was acquired. So there's some cases that are out there. They're just not popping up all over Kingdom Come. And if we identify others, we'll include them. I don't know if that's all I've got. Dennis, is there anything that you would like to chime in on, or Sally?
Not I. Thank you.
Again, I want to thank the steering committee. I have to tell you, it is amazing that I am grateful to the participation. It's, every single select committee member, except for Breyer, who is out of this country, attended, and he has given us a lot of feedback based on this report. So you're all impressive to be so involved, and I am grateful, because I think that as a result of this, we had a great discussion today. I'm really happy that people feel like there's an environment where you can really put forth your ideas, because that was the purpose of bringing together a really diverse group of people, because we all come at it from our own perspective. And that's really important, to be able to, in the end, bring this all together and put together a report. And so, Brian and Dennis, I know you have your work cut out for you now. You've gotten a lot of feedback. But as always, I would encourage, if select committee members have individual comments or things, please reach out to them. I am continually amazed at how responsive Brian and Dennis and Sally are. So if you have suggestions or things that you haven't thought about, make sure that you reach out, because I truly want this to be a collaborative, and I want you to feel like your voice is heard. So keep your comments coming, and we'll see the select committee in a couple weeks, and we will see, I mean, the steering committee, and we'll see the select committee on